and welcome to the Science of Psychology. Today we will explore why psychology is a science and not a pseudoscience, and we will also learn what a pseudoscience is. A pseudoscience is basically a fake science, something that mimics as a science, that looks like a science, but it is not based on scientific principles. For example, astrology is considered a pseudoscience. It may look scientific because there are the charts of the stars, and there are all these fancy words and terminology and explanations, but they're not based on scientific principles. However, the field of psychology is considered a science. And for a moment, I want you to think about what makes science a science? What are the criteria to make something a fact scientific? So you can pause the video for a moment and just write down what comes to mind briefly. Don't have to make this a big long exercise, but do that and then we will see each other and discuss it. All right, so psychology is a science and not a pseudoscience. So everything starts, all research really starts with curiosity and a question, a research question. Curiosity, think about children. They're very curious. They walk around the world. You have to observe kids and think about your own childhood. They explore everything. They pick up a rock to look at it from all sides and angles. And probably in their mind, they have some questions. Maybe they cannot even express them, but they want to know what's underneath here. Is it wet? Is it dry? Is it smooth? Is it bumpy? Those are all good questions, and all research starts with a good scientific research question. So now not every question is scientific or a research question. So what makes a research question scientific? It has to be testable. That sounds simple, but what does that mean? It has to be testable. So when the kid picks up the rock, maybe the kid asks a question, sees a rock and says, I wonder what's underneath. Is it humid, wet? Are there any animals crawling under the rock? Those are all testable questions, because once we lift up that rock, we can observe whether it is dry or wet, whether there are any creepy crawlies under the rock or not. That is a testable question. There are other interesting questions that are not testable. An example for that is there a God? You know, there are many different religions, and some religions believe in multiple gods, one God, etc. The general question, is there a God, is a very profound, interesting, important question, but it is not a research question because it is not testable. I cannot test it. I cannot figure out a way of knowing whether this is true or not in a scientific sense. So again, we are talking about science right now, and science may not be the only important thing in your life, but we need to be able to distinguish between something that is science and something that is not science. So a research question has to be testable, very important. It also has to be replicable. So the type of research, and when we go into our projects, we will really have to work on that. We will have to provide enough information about our question and our research so other people can go out and test the same thing and see if they come to the same conclusions. So replicable requires a lot of details. With the example, the rock and the child. So if the kid is asking, well, I wonder what's under the rock, that's a rather vague question, and other people don't really know what the kid was expecting or wondering to find under the rock, if that's the research question. But if the kid asks, I wonder if the bottom of the rock is wet or dry, I have enough information to say, well, I wonder if the rock in my location has a dry or wet bottom, or if, I can find certain creatures under the rock. That would be something that's replicable. So I always need to make it very concrete and specific, and stay away from vague information or questions. And then falsifiable. A scientific research question has to be falsifiable. That means I have to be able to say if my hypothesis, and we'll talk about that, so what I was expecting to find can be proven wrong. So if the child says, I wonder if there are any roly-polies under my rock, that is a falsifiable question, because once the child lifts up the rock, it can say yes or no. Some questions are too vague to be falsifiable, so then they're not scientific. For example, if I say, what is under the rock? I wonder what is under the rock. That's maybe an exploratory question in science, but it's hard to falsify it. Or the question we had earlier is even a better example. If I say, is there a God? It is not a falsifiable question, because it cannot be proven wrong, and therefore it is not a scientific question. So what do we do in psychology to make it a science? In psychology, we ask, and this is an important term, we ask empirical questions. Questions that are where we gain knowledge by observing. So empirical means I am collecting evidence by observing. And we observe in many different ways in the field of psychology. We can observe human behavior, or also animal behavior, but let's stick with human behavior by literally doing a natural observation. I can go to a playground and observe children's behavior and take notes on that. Or I can video record children at play, of course only with permission, and observe their behavior that way. I can also observe, I'm also a neuroscientist, so I am observing brain activity by using an MRI. That is another form of observation. We can observe heart rate when people maybe with anxiety encounter certain anxiety-provoking situations. Those are all observations. So we have different ways of observing, many different ways of observing. We can also ask people questions in form of an interview or surveys, and observe their behavior, let them self-evaluate their behavior. So we have many different forms, and research methods. This course will give you an overview of the many different ways we can design research to observe human behavior or animal behavior. And how do we observe? That is part of the science. We systematically observe. It's not just saying, oh, let me just go out and observe my neighbor, how he puts together this puzzle. But we have a plan. We put together, we develop a research design. So we systematically observe. So then some other people can replicate our study exactly step by step. It also helps us stay objective. And it's part of the scientific methods. And we will talk about the scientific method very soon, and the steps of the scientific method that we always have to go through in order to provide scientific evidence. And these 5 steps, we'll get to those, as I said. For now, I want you to make sure you know what empirical means. So it means gaining knowledge by making observations. But observations can take place in many different forms. It's not only just looking at somebody, but it's using different methods to observe or measure. And empiricism is the noun that goes with empirical. So a big question nowadays is, how do you know something, some information you receive by reading, looking at your phone, by watching the news, by even somebody telling you? How do you know it is scientific? So first of all, consider the source. The best source is a primary source. Primary means the first, so it's first-hand information. And in science, in the science of psychology, we want to find peer-reviewed primary sources, which I will explain peer-reviewed, but which is basically a journal article that publishes a research report from the researchers, written by the researchers themselves. So it's a first-hand report. So peer-reviewed means that before researchers can publish their research report in a science journal, a group of peers, so other researchers, will review their report and give suggestions, point out weaknesses, ask them to change maybe certain things or clarify certain parts of the research in order, so they do basically a fact checking and a double checking to make sure the report is written in a way that is acceptable for scientific journals. So we want, in certain journals, only publish articles when they're peer reviewed. And this is kind of the highest level of high quality evidence, when you go to the primary source and find a peer reviewed journal article. They are very hard to read, so you probably have encountered some of these, and we will encounter some of them in this course. And they're hard to read because they provide a lot of detail, exactly because of the reasons we talked about before. Every research study has to be replicable. We have to do systematic observations and provide all this detail to our peers that then say, okay, this is okay to be published for everybody to read now. And this is science. This is what we call science. So avoid secondary sources. Of course, most of us will read secondary sources. And what is a secondary source? Well, a secondary source is the news article or the blog or a book, even a textbook, a lecture, a discussion about that research article, that first-hand research report. And there's nothing really bad about that per se, to read the news article, because that's on an everyday basis, that's what we read. But we have to make sure, in order to really discuss something, that we at least can check back with the primary source, that we have some kind of link or reference to that primary source. So if I want to check that news article, or I find, news articles are abbreviations of what happened in a study. They sometimes summarize a study that took over a year in a few sentences. Think about all these vaccine studies for COVID right now. What do you really know about them? It would be good if you just hear something on the news to go back to that original study report and read some of it as much as you understand, to really know what was going on. How many people did they have in their study? Were there 30 or 3,000 or how many? There's a big difference. How old were these people? What did they exactly do, right? That's important information in order for me to be able to evaluate the merit of a study, and to say as a critical consumer, well, okay, this is one study, let me see what this other study did. And they may not always find the same things. And that's also important in science. We know that we can never prove something for certain, but we can collect a lot of evidence, and then we can make inferences of what we think is a good treatment or what we believe is a good intervention. So there's never 100% certainty in research. And this is why a lot of people run away from research and go to opinion and just to some, just repeat some opinions to hear from other people. But I want you to become a critical thinker, an objective observer, and evaluate all the sources of information that you encounter, especially when it comes to important topics. So this is the difference between a primary source, the first-hand original research report, and the secondary source that talks about that research study in some format, but it's an abbreviation. Important for us is the secondary source should give us a way to find that primary source, that original article. And our assignment for this week will be based on this, your knowledge about primary and secondary sources. So again, here we have peer-reviewed, primary source, secondary source. That should be vocabulary to remember. What else do you need to consider? Well, read more than the headline. Headlines are attention grabbers. Read more than the little tweet or the two-liner that pops up on your phone. Read a little bit, read at least the full news article. And if you have questions, double check with the primary source. But you need to read more than the headline or just repeat or retweet what somebody says. That is just why we're in such a mess with information, not only information overload, but also all this trolling of fake news and information that is not scientific. So consider the motivation of the authors or the publication and the financial interest. If you get somebody's tweet, or if you go to a blog, or if you read a newspaper, or also a research article, you have to read if there's any financial interest. You have to consider your news source. I know some people are like, it's CNN versus Fox or MSNBC versus Fox News. As an objective observer, you need to consider both sides and look at both sides, and then actually stay away from both. It's not, none of that is scientific, but try to find, they often talk about some interesting studies or information. Then try to go to the primary source. But know that there's a lot of motivation behind all of these different outlets. So be a critical consumer, use your critical thinking skills. Don't believe everything you hear. Avoid bias and thinking errors. Consider your own background, how you were raised and the world you lived in so far. And consider that every single person you encounter in your life will have their unique individual background and carry their own unique individual bias, and so do you, and so do we all. And we need to kind of be aware of that, at least, to be able to open our minds and overcome them and be able to be objective and impartial observers. And that's really very, very important today. Avoid just opinions that are not based in any kind of facts or truth. And as I said before, we will do a little assignment there just to distinguish between primary and secondary sources and see what that looks like. There will be a discussion post. In general, when I ask you to post a discussion, please, so I will post the first post on this topic, primary and secondary sources. And my post will contain the assignment instructions. So everything you see here will be on the assignment link also. And please hit the reply button. Do not start your own new thread, because then you may not get points for this assignment. This is a graded assignment. So what you'll do is, let's focus on research in psychology if you can, and try to find and the field of psychology is big and it overlaps with a lot of other fields like medicine and so on and so forth. So you have a lot to choose from. So go to some kind of news website. It doesn't matter what news website it is. And find a psychology research article, something current, not something from the year 1983, okay? Something current. And find a topic that interests you, and then read through that news article, and then make sure it gives you a reference to the primary source. So you are finding a secondary source, a news article, and then I want you to also know that there's a reference or find something that gives you this reference to the primary source. Because if the secondary source does that, if it lets me find that primary source, it is much more credible and believable to me, because it says, hey, if you need to get some more facts, go to the original study. And that's what I want you to do. And your reply post, again, you hit the reply button, has to contain the name of the news article you found, so the secondary source, and then name the primary source. You don't have to do a complete APA reference here. You can if you want to, but just tell us who were the authors of the study and maybe what was the name of the study. The authors alone is even fine. Maybe you have the publication year or the journal it was published in. Whatever information you will have, I will be generous for this first assignment. And then link me or link us to the news article you discussed. Because it is a discussion post, everybody will see it. It's kind of fun to see what research articles we found. And yeah, it's not a big deal, but I hope you will have fun with this assignment. And just to really emphasize the importance of understanding the difference between science and pseudoscience, or fact and fiction. See, this is what can happen when you don't know the difference. Donald Trump suspended from Twitter, banned from Facebook and Instagram indefinitely following Capitol riots. Well, at some point, there will be consequences if you just disperse information that is not based in facts, that is just inciting, that is trying to, again, talk about motivation and ulterior motives to disperse information. But this is on such a big, large scale right now that I needed to mention it. And I also want to say this is not a partisan political statement. This is a statement from a scientist. I am a scientist, and it is important to me that the information that the public can access is based in some kind of facts and deliberation, because it's very dangerous to play with non-facts, with non-scientific evidence in order to change people's behavior. That's all I have to say. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.